Okay, everyone's heard of Alexander the Great, but not a lot of people know that he met a series of monsters on his various exploits into India, and he wrote home about these monsters to his teacher Aristotle. So today we're going to talk about Alexander's creatures and monsters, and in particular, the monster of Sweetwater Lake.
The story of this creature is told in what's called the Alexander Romance, which is a medieval manuscript. And here's some images. These were constantly drawn in illuminated manuscripts in the medieval period. And I find these kind of charming. I think when I was younger, I thought these were awful because they look so juvenile, but now I've really grown accustomed to them. I really like this guy on the left, and I tried to add a figure like him in my drawing. I was inspired by this kind of childish, but still kind of compelling character. And I decided I would try and do it as a woodblock cut, a woodblock print, so that it would have this sort of Renaissance look to it. I've done some before. I did that one that was based on Albrecht Dürer's Rhinoceros, and this is my woodcut of Sasquatch. I find it's exhausting, and this time I tried to switch from a block of wood to kind of a linoleum block to try to get an easier cut. I started designing creatures, and here's this guy that I was trying to do a representation of. I like him with the long spear. I thought I'd draw him on the right side and draw the creature sort of looming up on the left. So I'm just starting to sketch. I'm inspired by these sort of medieval and Renaissance images, and I'm hoping to get something that looks kind of ancient or, vaguely medieval. And I think with the woodblock technique, it's really going to look quite old. Let me tell you a little bit about this story. After defeating King Porus in the Punjab region, Alexander the Great chased the tyrant farther into India. And then Alexander says, however, it commonly happens that when a man achieves some success, this is pretty soon followed by adversity. And basically lost in the deserts of the Indus Valley, Alexander and his army found themselves dehydrated and demoralized by a fierce and hostile environment. And marching through the desert, Alexander's forces were so thirsty that some of the soldiers began to lick iron, drink oil, and even drink their own urine. A devoted soldier named Zephyrus found a tiny puddle of water in the hollow of a rock, poured it into his helmet, and brought it to Alexander to drink. Alexander was moved by the soldier's generosity, and he poured the water out on the ground in front of the whole army to demonstrate that he, as their leader, would suffer with them. This show of strength and solidarity gave inspiration to the troops, and they marched on until they found a river. And what's interesting is when they get to this river, they see people way on the other side. And Alexander's trying to get their attention, and finally he sends a group of soldiers into the river to cross over to this other side to talk to the natives there. And halfway through the water, they're suddenly attacked by a huge group of hippos, which basically tear them limb to limb. And he describes this in the letter back to Aristotle. Now, we don't know whether this is a real letter to Aristotle. It's probably apocryphal. It probably was made up in the medieval period, but it still tells us a lot about what people were thinking and what they were afraid of at the time. So after this nightmare, they march on, and eventually they end up at this lake, and he calls it the Lake of Sweet Water because the water's finally so delicious, and they camp overnight, but horrible things follow. Serpents start to come out of the jungle and attack them on the beach. And after killing some of the serpents, the soldiers were relieved to see the creatures retreat, but their hopes of finally getting some sleep were dashed when dragons began to slither out of the woods toward them. They were larger than the serpents, thicker than columns, with a crest on their head, breasts upright, and mouths wide open to spew poisonous breath. And so he goes on describing these horrific creatures. They keep coming wave after wave. And what I'm doing here in the drawing is I'm basically trying to transfer the drawing over to the block, and that requires some tracing paper, and I trace it on one side, I trace it on the other, and then I trace it again, and that transfers it onto the block so I can start cutting. Eventually, as they're fighting these creatures on the beach, Alexander says, "It was now the 5th watch of the night, and we wanted to rest. But now white lions arrived, bigger than bulls. They shook their heads and roared loudly and charged at us. But we met them with the points of our hunting spears and killed them. There was great consternation in the camp at all these alarms. The next creatures to arrive were enormous pigs of various colors. It just seems like a disaster, right? We fought with them too in the same way. Then came bats as big as doves, their teeth like those of men. They flew right in our face, and some of the soldiers were wounded. And then he says, they look over and they see this gigantic beast. So as if this onslaught were not enough, the men were astonished next to see an enormous beast, larger than an elephant, emerge from the forest. The behemoth, first appearing in the distance, headed for the lake to drink, but then saw Alexander's encampment. It turned quickly, revealing 3 ominous horns on its forehead, and began charging towards the men. Alexander ordered a squadron of soldiers to meet the earth-shaking juggernaut head-on, but they were overrun. After engaging the monster in difficult battle for some time, the soldiers managed finally to kill it, but only after the creature had taken 76 Macedonian warriors to a bloody end. So he's so angry at this that he takes the guides who had brought them there, and he basically he breaks their legs and leaves them to be eaten by the creatures the following night. So it's a gruesome story, but it's also kind of exciting and a wonderful glimpse into this ancient world of monsters. All right, you can see I'm basically getting a clear image here, so I can cut.
Okay, I'm going to be using this little blade to do a lino cut, and the actual cutting in order to do this sort of woodblock print is going to be very fine grained. So off come the glasses and on come the magnifying glasses. Now, okay, wait for it. Oh yeah.
Now starts some laborious work. And this is a fairly small size, as you can see here. And the substance, the substrate, is even softer than linoleum. So you'd think, well, this has got to be easier. And yet it's just a painstaking process. Here I'm just starting and I've got sort of clumsy hands. Eventually, after 4 hours of this, I have a good rhythm going and I know what I'm doing. But you'll see that I'm using the gouge to dig a line. But oftentimes you have to sort of stop what you're doing and go into the lines and score them. You have to use this thin blade and basically dig in with the blade so that when you're gouging, the gouge will hit that line and stop, and you'll get a clean cut. If not, you end up just sort of with some raggedy edges, and it's incredibly ineffective. So there's just it's a learning process, and I do think the effect is worth it, but it is a surprisingly labor-intensive process. Woodcuts originated in China around 200 A.D. and they were doing sort of block printing long before Europe, but their techniques were introduced into Europe in like the 1400s, maybe the 13th century. So I guess this would have been the late 1200s, but it's in the 1400s when it rises to a level of incredible sophistication and high art, and probably the most, the zenith of woodblock printing is probably Albrecht Dürer, the great German printmaker who lived from 1471 to 1528. And I'm sure you've seen many Dürer prints. He basically developed such gorgeous line work that I just don't think anyone's even in all this time since then sort of surpassed his genius.
I wanted you to see where where the cutting has. I wanted you to see how far the cutting has gotten. I've been working on this now for many hours, and I wanted you just to see, like, it is exhausting. I got a terrible headache My neck is killing me. My back hurts. I've been wearing this damn thing the whole time. I'm actually on my knees at my table because I can't quite sit anymore because my back hurts so much. And so I just want to give you the general sense that, I think if art is supposed to be therapeutic and relaxing, and it definitely is, but you don't get anywhere without a lot of hard work. And sometimes it makes you very uncomfortable, but you're driven to finish the piece, and it's a kind of helpful addiction. Those of you who are artists and do this kind of stuff know exactly what I'm talking about. Those of you who are new to it might be sort of surprised to hear that it can be extremely draining, exhausting, and punishing. But when it turns out...
Now we're going to put some ink on this thing. And I'm basically laying out some ink and mixing it up. It's quite thick. I've tried to water it down before, but that creates a series of problems because it gets too far into the grooves. So you have to lay on this very thick black ink, and I start printing, and it is awful. And I can't get the look I want, and everything is too light. And I'm getting increasingly discouraged, and really I do this maybe 10 times, and I just think the whole thing's a disaster. And finally, after about the 10th time, I start to get something that looks good. So here was the first print that to me started to look like what I had in my head. So it was incredibly satisfying to peel that off and see that I had a decent image. Not perfect, all kinds of flaws, but look at the penetration of the ink into the paper, the forms, the contrast. It's got the qualities that I was going for, and it really does look like something from the late medieval or the sort of early Renaissance period. So I'm very pleased with how it's looking. I start to basically add a little bit of white charcoal to try to accentuate and highlight certain areas. And I experimented on another version just to see whether I like this, and it is a subtle enough effect that it's, it doesn't jump out at you, but it really is a powerful effect when you look at it, to add this white to the black and to that ground color of the tan or dun color. And I really like the final effect of it. So here's the final drawing. Very pleased with how it turned out. It's got a lot of strong punch, very dramatic, very clean lines, and high contrast. So if you liked it, please hit the subscribe button as usual. Come back and see more. I'm going to try to post something weekly. And as usual, thanks for watching. All right, take care until next time. Cheers.